The airport buzzed with its usual blend of excitement and chaos. Passengers rushed past, the intercom echoed announcements, and the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases clattered against the tiled floors. Amidst this orchestrated disorder stood Gate 24, a hub of activity, its seating area packed with travelers eagerly awaiting their flight to Dallas. In the crowd was a woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer and matching heels that clicked sharply as she moved. Her demeanor radiated quiet superiority, her eyes scanning the first-class line with a critical gaze, as though measuring who truly belonged there. Her expression tightened when her eyes landed on a young man no older than 16. Standing confidently in the line, his outfit stood in stark contrast to her polished attire. Casual jeans, a hoodie, and a bright red hat perched atop his head. The embroidered letters on the hat, MAGA, seemed to ignite something within her. Her jaw tightened, and she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." Her disapproval was palpable, her thoughts racing as she wondered how someone like him had made it into this line. Was he even old enough to afford a first-class ticket? Did he think that hat granted him some special privilege? Her indignation swelled, and she resolved not to let this affront pass unnoticed. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, and the line began to shuffle forward. The young man clutched his boarding pass, his attention flitting between his phone and the gate agent as he prepared to step forward. The woman moved closer, her sharp heels clicking decisively on the floor. She wasn't about to keep her opinions to herself. As the young man reached the gate, the woman angled herself in front of him, blocking his path. Her polished demeanor now tinged with irritation, she addressed him loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Excuse me," she began, her tone dripping with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong line." The young man blinked, momentarily puzzled. Glancing around to confirm his surroundings, he replied simply, "No, this is first class." He held up his boarding pass as if to clarify any confusion. Her eyes narrowed as they fixed on the bold red hat, the letters emblazoned across it daring her to look away. She let out a skeptical laugh. "First class," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're telling me you bought a first-class ticket?" Her words drew the attention of others nearby. Heads turned, curious glances darting between the two as whispers rippled through the crowd. The young man remained composed, though a faint crease appeared on his brow. "Yes, ma'am," he said politely but firmly. "Is there a problem?" Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her irritation flaring. "Look," she said, her voice sharpening, "I don't know who you think you are, but first class is for people who, well, let's just say it's for people who belong there." She gestured pointedly at his hat. "And I'm not sure someone with that attitude belongs here." The young man tilted his head slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence seemed to embolden her further. "You know," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "there are plenty of seats back in economy where you'd probably feel more comfortable." By now, more onlookers had turned their attention to the unfolding scene. A man in a business suit muttered under his breath, "What's her problem?" while a young woman cradling a toddler glared at the woman with visible disapproval. The gate agent, noticing the commotion, glanced up from her screen with a look of concern. Despite the growing tension, the young man squared his shoulders and drew a steady breath. His calm demeanor remained unshaken as he prepared to respond. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady and composed, "I'm just here to board my flight like everyone else. My ticket's valid, and I don't think it's anyone's business where I sit." His words, simple yet firm, seemed only to fuel her indignation. She let out a scoff and turned to the crowd as if seeking validation. "Can you believe this?" she exclaimed, gesturing toward him. "First class used to mean something. Now, apparently, anyone can just—" "That's enough," interrupted a voice from the gate. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, had stepped out from behind her desk. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The woman turned toward her, feigning innocence. "I'm just saying, I think it's a little suspicious that someone like him," she paused, casting a disdainful glance at the young man, "is in this line. I mean, look at him." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves. The gate agent raised a hand, silencing the chatter. "Let me see your boarding pass, sir," she said to the young man. Without hesitation, he handed it over. She scanned it, her eyes flicking to her screen before nodding decisively. "Mr. Barron, first class. Everything checks out." A wave of stunned silence washed over the onlookers. The name hung in the air, its significance dawning on the crowd. All eyes snapped back to the young man. He stood unfazed, his expression calm and composed, as though he'd been through this kind of scrutiny before. The woman blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. "Wait, you're—" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone polite but unwavering. "That's my name." Murmurs turned into hushed exclamations. Some passengers reached for their phones, snapping pictures or hurriedly searching his name. The tension shifted, yet the woman's indignation lingered. But what happened next would alter the tone of the moment entirely, as Barron prepared to address the crowd with words that no one expected. Barron stood still, letting the weight of the moment settle. His calm demeanor betrayed no anger, only a quiet strength as he looked at the woman who had confronted him. The crowd, now entirely invested, waited to see how he would respond. For a brief moment, the airport seemed to pause, the usual din of announcements and rolling luggage fading into the background. Drawing a steady breath, Barron spoke, his voice calm yet resolute. "Ma'am," he began, addressing the woman directly, "I'm here to board my flight like everyone else. My ticket is valid, and where I sit shouldn't concern anyone but me." His words, though measured and polite, carried an undeniable weight. The woman scoffed, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and indignation. She glanced around, seeking support from the surrounding passengers. "Can you believe this?" she said loudly, gesturing toward him. "First class used to mean something. Now, apparently, anyone can just—" "Ma'am," Barron interrupted, his tone unwavering but devoid of hostility. "I think how we act says more about us than where we sit. Don't you?" The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and a few people exchanged knowing glances. Barron continued, his gaze steady. "My dad always told me to treat people with respect, even if they don't show it back. That's because how you treat others says more about you than it does about them. And today, I think that applies here." His words hit with a quiet force. The woman's confidence wavered visibly, her arms loosening from their defensive cross. Around them, the crowd was riveted. A man in a business suit leaned over to whisper, "That's impressive for a kid his age." But Barron wasn't finished. He adjusted his posture slightly, his voice softening without losing its clarity. "You don't know me," he said. "You saw a hat and made assumptions about who I am, where I belong, and what kind of person I must be. But here's the thing, that hat doesn't define me. Just like your words today don't have to define you." The woman's face turned crimson. Her earlier boldness had dissolved, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. Barron's words, delivered with such composure and sincerity, had not only disarmed her, but also held up a mirror to her behavior. By now, the gate agent had stepped back, watching the interaction unfold with a look of quiet approval. Nearby passengers began nodding, some muttering phrases like, "Well said," and "Good for him." A young mother holding a toddler gave the woman a pointed glance before whispering to the person beside her, "He's handling this better than most adults would." Barron took another step forward, the red hat resting confidently on his head. "The world already has enough judgment and division," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I don't see the point in adding to it, do you?" The woman swallowed hard, her earlier indignation now replaced by an uncomfortable realization. She glanced at the gate agent, who was waiting patiently for her to move aside, and then back at Barron. But before she could respond, Barron added, "I hope your day gets better, and I hope next time you'll think twice before making someone else feel small." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of his words resonating with everyone present. The man in the business suit let out a low whistle, while someone in the back softly clapped. Slowly, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. Barron handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled warmly and gestured for him to proceed. As he walked down the jet bridge, the red hat still visible, the crowd began to stir. Conversations erupted, with passengers exchanging thoughts about what had just unfolded. "I've never seen someone that young handle something like that so gracefully," said a woman seated near the gate. "Shows a lot of character," added the man in the business suit. He didn't have to say anything, but he made his point without stooping to her level. Meanwhile, the woman who had sparked the confrontation stood frozen in place. The eyes of the crowd weighed heavily on her, their judgment now directed toward her actions. She fidgeted, her gaze darting around as she struggled to process what had just happened. "You know," said the young mother, her tone calm but firm, "you really owe him an apology." The woman flinched slightly at the words, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean," she began, but her voice trailed off. The truth was undeniable, and she knew it. She had been wrong about him, about the situation, and about her own behavior. The gate agent cleared her throat, motioning for the remaining passengers to step forward. The woman shuffled to the back of the line, her earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet regret. As the line moved forward, conversations continued to ripple through the terminal. "That was something else," murmured a teenager to her friend, holding up her phone where a video of the encounter was already trending. "Yeah," the friend replied. "But did you hear what he said? How you act says more about you." "That's deep." Even those who hadn't directly witnessed the exchange found themselves drawn into the energy of the moment. The tension, the unexpected confrontation, and Barron's composed response had created a ripple effect, one that would linger far beyond Gate 24. The woman finally boarded the plane, her head low as she passed through the first-class cabin. Barron was seated near the window, the red hat now resting on the tray table in front of him. He didn't look up as she walked by, seemingly engrossed in a book. She hesitated, the words she wanted to say catching in her throat. Finally, she managed a soft, "Excuse me." Barron glanced up, his expression neutral but not unkind. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cabin. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. That was wrong of me." Barron studied her for a moment before nodding. "Apology accepted," he said simply, his tone as calm as ever. The woman lingered for a moment, unsure if she should say more. But Barron had already returned his attention to his book, signaling that the conversation was over. Taking the cue, she moved to her seat, her heart heavy with regret, but also a glimmer of hope for change. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere remained reflective, the impact of the encounter at Gate 24 continuing to resonate with everyone aboard. As the plane ascended into the sky, the hum of the engines seemed to settle the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seats, flipped through in-flight magazines, or scrolled on their phones. Yet, the energy from the incident at Gate 24 lingered like a quiet undertone, weaving through conversations and private thoughts. The woman who had confronted Barron Trump sat by the window, staring blankly at the clouds outside. Her reflection in the glass showed a face still flushed with embarrassment, but her mind was a whirlwind. Barron's words replayed over and over. Asterisk, "How you act says more about you than it does about anyone else." Asterisk. Her initial indignation had been replaced by regret and self-reflection. She thought of the assumptions she had made, all based on a hat. She had felt justified in her anger, emboldened by her own sense of right and wrong. But now, she realized how small and petty her actions had been. Behind her, conversations buzzed quietly. "That kid handled himself better than most adults I know," a man murmured to his seatmate. "No kidding," came the reply. "He could have gone off on her, but instead, he just stayed calm." Makes you think. Not far away, a young mother cradling her sleeping toddler glanced down at her child. She thought about the kind of person she wanted her son to grow up to be. Someone like Barron. Someone who could rise above hostility with grace. In first class, Barron sat by the window, his red hat now resting in the seat pocket in front of him. A book lay open in his lap, but his eyes were unfocused, gazing out at the endless blue sky. He had spent his life navigating moments like these, where assumptions and judgments were hurled at him because of his name, his family, or even the way he dressed. He had learned to stay calm, to not let the weight of other people's opinions crush him. His father's advice always echoed in his mind. Asterisk, rise above it, son. Always rise above it. Asterisk, and today, he had done just that. But even so, he couldn't shake the sadness that came with knowing how quick people were to judge. Nearby, two teenagers whispered excitedly, one holding up her phone. It's already on TikTok, she said, showing the video she had recorded. Look at the comments. People are saying he's so mature for his age. Yeah, her friend replied. He totally called her out, but in the nicest way. That's rare. The murmurs of passengers reflecting on what they had witnessed filled the cabin. Even those who hadn't seen the confrontation firsthand were now hearing about it, the story spreading like ripples in a pond. One older man, dressed sharply in a business suit, scrolled through his emails but found himself pausing. He thought about how often he, too, had made snap judgments about others, whether based on appearance, status, or even a single word. The incident at the gate had given him pause, a moment to reevaluate his own biases. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the woman from Gate 24 finally broke from her thoughts. She turned to the passenger beside her, a kind-looking older woman who had been silent until now. I made a fool of myself back there, didn't I? She asked quietly, her voice tinged with regret. The older woman smiled gently. We all have moments like that, she said. What matters is what you do next. The words struck a chord. The woman nodded, her gaze drifting back to the window. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could take it as a lesson, a painful but necessary one. In the rows behind, the conversations carried on. It's not about the hat, someone said. It's about the assumptions we make without even realizing it. Exactly, another voice chimed in. That kid didn't just defend himself. He made us all think about how we treat people. As the plane began its descent into Dallas, the passengers prepared for landing. Yet, the atmosphere remained contemplative. People adjusted their seatbelts and stowed their belongings. But the story of what had happened at Gate 24 stayed with them. For the woman, the descent felt like a metaphor for her own reckoning. She replayed her confrontation with Barron, his composed response, and the humiliating moment when she realized she had been wrong. She thought of the courage it took for him to remain calm, to not retaliate, and to respond with dignity. When the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings began. Barron retrieved his hat and tucked it under his arm as he prepared to disembark. The woman hesitated, then made a decision. As the aisle cleared and passengers began filing out, she approached Barron, who was still seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. Excuse me, she said softly. He looked up, his expression neutral but not unkind. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly, and to apologize again. You didn't deserve how I treated you. Barron nodded, his face calm but thoughtful. Thank you, he said. It takes courage to apologize. I hope you have a better day. The woman smiled faintly, a mix of gratitude and lingering shame on her face. As she walked away, she felt lighter, as though she had left something behind in that brief exchange. Barron stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder and stepping into the aisle. Behind him, passengers whispered quietly, some offering him nods of respect as he passed. By the time he exited the plane and entered the bustling terminal in Dallas, the incident at Gate 24 had already begun to spread far beyond the airport. The video of his response was being shared across social media, sparking conversations about respect, assumptions, and the power of composure. For those who had been there, the moment was more than just a viral story. It was a reminder of how powerful kindness and dignity could be, even in the face of hostility. And for Barron, it was just another day, a chance to rise above, to hold on to the values his family had taught him, and to remind the world, in his own quiet way, that how we act truly does say more about us than anything else.